Morning and welcome to the Monday Morning Message on Chapter 3, Communications in the Medical Office. So this chapter is actually fairly near and dear to me, partly because communication in the medical office takes on many different forms, right? It takes on written form, verbal form, non-verbal forms, electronic communications. These are all part of the medical office or a hospital setting. But what I get back from employers and potential employers typically is that communications is usually one of the negative critiques that I get about students. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over some of the key points. I am going to skip some of the things in your PowerPoint presentation, but I want to try to touch on some of the real key aspects of this chapter. Okay, so let's take a look at your PowerPoint here. Some of the key terms, of course, active listening, body language. These are key terms in this chapter. When I think about active listening, I think about something like really paying attention to what somebody is saying to you, looking them in the eye when they're talking to you and when you're talking to them and trying to convey a message. Same thing even on the phone. To me, active listening happens during a telephone call as well, and that's based on tone and inflection and asking follow-up questions or asking whoever's on the other end of the line if they have questions about anything that you just discussed. So to me, that's all a part of active listening. Body language, of course, face-to-face, therapeutic touch, therapeutic approaches, therapeutic communication is very important, especially if you're doing any direct patient care. So let's take a look at the 5 C's of communication. So the 5 C's of communication: content. The communication must include all of the pertinent facts, right? So what are we trying to convey? And what exactly is it? That's the content. Is the communication concise? Does it get to the point? Does it not beat around the bush? And that's a saying, and in particular an American saying that we're going to talk about later. Clarity. Is the communication clear? Is it easily understood with minimal technical language, especially in healthcare? Is it coherent? Does it make logical sense? Does it follow a logical format? And then check. The communicator must ask for feedback. So when we talk about like the feedback loop, right, there's the sender and the receiver, and the sender sends a message that is encoded, and the receiver receives the message and has to decode the message and then provide some form of feedback to make sure that the message was communicated properly. Does the message need to be rephrased? That kind of all falls into this 5 C's of communication. Some good guidelines: don't chew gum or eat food while talking to somebody. In particular on the phone, it's funny. Of course, in person we can see if somebody's chewing on something. On the phone, it can be very distracting if somebody's chewing. If you're snapping gum on the phone, it also says that maybe you're not active listening. So be very careful with that. Speak loud enough to be heard. One of the things I would tell you too about the phone is be very careful with things like putting the phone mouthpiece too close to your mouth. If you have that mouthpiece and it's right on top of your mouth, then things get really muffled, right? They get really muffled. Always keep about an inch or so worth of distance between the mouthpiece and your mouth, and that will keep the receiver or the person on the other end of the line from hearing a muffled conversation. Okay. Pronounce all words correctly. I typically tell you this: if you don't know how to pronounce a word or you don't know the meaning of the word, don't use it. If you don't pronounce it correctly, that says a little bit of something about your professionalism, and patients will pick up on that. The same thing it holds true if you don't understand the meaning of a word. If you use it and then somebody asks you to clarify what that means and you can't clarify it, then I automatically go to, then why are you using the word if you don't even know what the word means? So, because that tells me maybe you're not using the word right. If I don't know what it means and you can't tell me what it means, maybe you're not even using it correctly. So be careful with that, right? Match your tempo of speech to that of the listener. Some people, you can talk fairly quickly. I have a tendency to do that, but I also try to read my audience, understand where they're at and whether I need to slow things down, whether I can speed things up. It typically depends on the audience. And I think over time, it's all about practice. I always say practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes better. It makes improvement. So I'm always practicing when I'm communicating with patients or with other medical professionals. There's always a sense of practicing my communication skills. Same thing with you guys. I'm always practicing with students, my communication and my delivery, okay? Speak directly to the person. That shows active listening. Don't interrupt people when they're talking. That's just common courtesy. Use terminology that's appropriate. Again, don't use things that are above somebody's intellect pertaining to that subject. So when we talk to other healthcare professionals, oftentimes we do talk in medical language, we talk in medical terms, we use abbreviations that are very specific to medicine. Those things are not common for the average patient in most cases. So using those things, all that really does, honestly, it gets confusing for the patient. It causes the patient to ask more questions and have you, have to interpret all of that stuff for them. So typically we say when we're talking to non-medical professionals, make sure you don't use too much medical jargon or medical language. You have to really use layman's terms when you're talking with patients or non-healthcare professionals, okay? Make sure you are HIPAA compliant. Be careful about confidentiality issues. Be careful about where you're talking about possibly sensitive patient information, okay? I think we've already touched on the active listening, okay? Be very careful about, errors, typographic errors, punctuation errors when we're talking about written communication, okay? And I'm going to skip a couple of the things here in just a second. Business letters, a form of written communication. Business letters are typically, we send those out to other doctors. We send those to doctors that we refer patients to. Those are, formal communication practices when you're using a business letter. This is the components of the business letter. Letterhead is typically standard, right? The date, the subject line, a salutation or a greeting, a welcome, okay? Then the body of the letter, which, what are we trying to convey? We put that in the body, and then usually a complimentary closing. Okay, so we'll skip a couple of slides here. What are some of the reasons for sending letters to patients? Well, it may be sending it for change in office hours, maybe a change in some other policy like a no-show fee policy or some kind of payment policy. Could be to notify them of a scheduled appointment. It could be to notify them of a skipped appointment or a missed appointment, or that they have an outstanding bill with the office. Most of these things require a business letter. Okay, proofread, always, double and triple check your work. I oftentimes like to have somebody else look at what I did. So if I create a letter that's getting sent out to multiple people, I may have one of my coworkers or colleagues take a look at that, and they'll let me know. If it doesn't make sense to them, it's probably not going to make sense to who I'm sending it to. So I typically have somebody else, kind of proofread my work, in particular if it's going out to a large group of people. Okay. There are some abbreviations that we don't use in healthcare. The American Hospital Association has determined that there are some abbreviations that are not for use in the hospital at all. The part of the problem with that is you will find older chart notes that have these abbreviations in it. So in my view, it's actually important to know those abbreviations that we're not using anymore, because you may run across them in chart notes. And then you'll be asking, what does that mean? So these are some examples of some things that we try not to use in the office, like U for unit. It can be mistaken for a 0 sometimes. Let's see what some others. Things like QD and QID and QOD, those things can oftentimes be mistaken for things. Like this one says, a period after the Q may be mistaken for QI, or the O is mistaken for an I, because QID means 4 times a day. But these things can be somewhat misinterpreted. So be careful with that. If you do work, especially in the hospital setting, make sure that you know what the acceptable, what the do not use abbreviation list is, and what are acceptable abbreviations in the hospital setting or your organization. Some organizations, you may work at one place that uses a particular abbreviation, like let's say C/O, which oftentimes in my practice has meant complains of. Well, complains of is the same as a chief complaint, CC: chief complaint. But I typically say whatever that practice is using as their standard abbreviation, that's what you need to use for the abbreviation whenever you're charting. So if you worked at a practice that used CC for chief complaint, but now you're working someplace that uses C/O for complains of, use whatever is appropriate for that practice. Okay, because that becomes kind of the standard and the norm, and everybody knows what that is in that particular office. Okay, inter-office memos, these are just correspondences. They're not typically not official. They're usually just for office use. That has nothing to do with patients, or has nothing to do with sending the patient these memos. So it could be things like somebody's going to be on vacation, or maybe there's a change to some inter-office procedure that only the office personnel needs to use. Okay, we're going to skip the stuff on the envelopes and all of that. Just know that standard business size envelopes are number 10 for standard business envelopes. Mail classifications, kind of like to talk about this a little bit because there are some differences and there are some things you need to know about this. Priority mail, I like that. It says it's the second fastest service provided by the United States Postal Service. Okay, generally priority mail arrives in 2 to 3 days. Okay, we have other different mail services like media mail or standard mail. Media mail cannot be used to send any type of advertising, which is important. Sometimes these services are a little bit less expensive than other services. But usually this type of stuff takes anywhere from 2 to 10 to 14 days, possibly a week to 2, to get to the receiver. Registered mail offers, trackability. Typically get a tracking number with registered mail. Okay. Email, kind of like to talk about this too. Email is oftentimes not secure. It's not the most the safest way to send pertinent information to a patient. So what you'll find is a lot of, especially smaller practices, don't use email to convey messages to patients. Larger organizations like a Kaiser, for instance, they'll send emails. A lot of times those are encrypted, so only the receiver can actually read the contents of the email. And usually those emails that you get are typically no reply emails, or they allow you to reply one time. The problem with emails between a physician and patient is that oftentimes and this is no offense to, we're all patients, but so no offense to patients, but oftentimes what happens is patients start to potentially take advantage of it. Maybe they take advantage of it, don't even realize they're doing it, but they'll start sending emails and hoping that they're going to get this back and forth communication with the doctor. The problem is doctors only get paid if they're seeing patients in the clinic. So having a doctor sit at their desk and answer emails back and forth is not efficient. It's not a good use of finances, and it's certainly not a way to make enough money to keep the doors open. So you won't find a lot of doctors, especially in the smaller practices, that are going to be answering emails all day long. If they do, they'll never see patients, and we won't make any revenue, and that's an issue, right? So that's got to be taken pretty seriously when we talk about whether we're going to do email or not. Practices that I've worked in, we did not do emails, just because we knew either we're going to have to hire somebody that's going to sit and do emails all day, or the doctor is going to be inundated with emails and not see enough patients to bring in enough revenue to keep the doors open. Okay. Send only non-confidential information via email. And that's true unless the patient has consented to things like sending their lab work results via their email. The patient's consenting to that as an alternative delivery method. So if the patient is okay with that and is consented to it, and we have documentation of that, then we can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we shouldn't be sending confidential information via email. Okay, handling incoming mail, trust me, we get a lot of mail in the doctor's office. We receive, sometimes we receive, checks from insurance companies, bills with checks in them from patients. We receive correspondence from other doctors where we've sent a patient to see them. They dictated a note after the visit. Maybe instead of faxing it to us, they sent it via mail. So we get a ton of mail on a daily basis in the doctor's office. Typically, we assign one person to handle all of that mail, and that really could be anybody in the doctor's office. Same thing with the fax machine. We get hundreds of faxes, if not 1,000 or more every day. We get lab work, we get copies of patient chart information for new patients that are coming to see us. We get consultations from other doctors that maybe we referred patients to. So somebody's got to be in charge of that as well. Last practice that I worked in, that was my job. So not only was I rooming patients and drawing blood and giving injections and performing EKGs as a medical assistant for one provider, but I had other duties. One of them was every fax that came in, I touched first, and then I divvied those out. I parsed them into groups, like this is for Dr. X, these are for Dr. Y, these are refills, these are referrals, and then made sure that all those documents got to the right people so that they could then do with them what they need to do. That was also on top of, I was responsible for purchasing all of the injectables, medications and immunizations in my office. I was also responsible for what we call a tickler, so all male follow-up exams, testicular exams, prostate checks, lipid checks, anything for the men in our practice that we had to send out a mail reminder through the mail for males. If we had to send out a reminder, my responsibility was to send those in a timely fashion when they needed to be sent. So, as a medical assistant and an X-ray technician, there's a lot of different moving pieces every day in particular in family practice that we deal with. So, so when we talk about face-to-face communication, this is still a very face-to-face intense business, right? One of the things that I say is to really pay attention to nonverbal communication, nonverbal language. Patients will display certain nonverbal cues, and they can tell you things, or at least get your antennas up. So you may be able to tell through nonverbal cues that a patient is anxious, that a patient's upset, that a patient is maybe in pain. These are things to make note of. Some of these things you may be able to broach with the patient at the time. Some of those things you may not, and you may want to let the provider know that, this is how the patient was with me when I was doing their check-in and their interview. So that's important to pay attention to nonverbal cues. They oftentimes can tell you a lot. Some examples, right? Yawning or slouching in a chair. That could be a sign of boredom, possibly. Widened eyes and raised eyebrows. That could be a sign of being scared. Pain, right? Stiff and painful movements. Sometimes I use, the crossed arms as that could potentially be a patient that doesn't want to share or doesn't feel comfortable. And this is a way to kind of close off. So, pay attention to those things. They will kind of guide your conversations with patients. Okay. Ways to project professional image: maintain eye contact. Don't cross your arms. Again, see, this may tell a patient that you're not interested in what they're saying, or maybe you're taking some offense to what they're saying, or you don't believe what they're saying. It could be construed by the patient that way. So be careful with your own body language. Use handshakes to meet people. Smile when appropriate, or, smile is appropriate, but smile when it's appropriate. Avoid frowning, maintain correct posture, and maintain a comfortable social distance. And typically I would tell you that's about arm's length, which is roughly 3 feet. So 3 feet is pretty good social distance for having a conversation that is not, encroaching on somebody's personal bubble. Okay. Therapeutic touch and communication is very important. It conveys a feeling to the patient of empathy, right? Put yourself in somebody else's position, but it can also convey a sense of sympathy. Taught a class recently where I said, saying you're sorry for the situation that somebody is in shows a level of sympathy to a patient. So it doesn't mean you're apologizing that you did something to them. So when I say something like, I'm really sorry that you're going through this right now, what that's showing is sympathy for their current situation. I'm sympathetic to it. Okay. Communicating with physicians. Refer to the physician by formal title unless they've instructed you otherwise. And this is something I had to get used to when I first got into this profession 20 plus years ago. Was, I always address doctors as, Dr. So-and-so, Dr. Smith, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Thomas, whatever the case was. And what I found was in very short period of time, most doctors today are pretty easygoing about just call me by my first name, or call me doctor in front of the patient, but when it's just me and you, just call me by my first name. I've worked in practices. I had a good funny story about that. One time I was working for a physician in Denver, Dr. Sullivan, and I kept calling him Dr. Sullivan. And after, about a month or so of working with him, and I worked for him for a couple of years, after about the first month, he finally called me in his office and he said, here's the deal. I'm going to fire you if you call me Dr. Sullivan one more time. And I said, I don't understand why. That's who you are. And he said, no, my mother named me Neil. Just call me Neil. He said, I tell the patients to call me Neil. I'd rather have them call me that. And I said, well, I do it out of respect for, for you being a doctor and everything that entailed to become a doctor. And he said, I get it and I appreciate it, but just call me Neil from now on, please. He said, my mama named me Neil. That's what everybody calls me. I'm more comfortable if you call me Neil. So from that point on, that's what I did. So until you're given that green light, always address professionals with their professional title. Okay. Always try to maintain professionalism. I typically will tell you this too, oftentimes, that you may get constructive criticism in this profession from time to time, and that's good. And one of the things that I would highly encourage you to remember is it's just business. Don't take things too personally. Unfortunately, and even I was guilty of it, and early on in my career, of taking things a little too personal, and that's usually not the intent. So when somebody is giving you some constructive criticism about how to do something, or maybe how to communicate with a patient, or maybe something you shouldn't say to a patient because it could be construed as practicing medicine, and if you're not a provider, then you can't practice medicine. Just simply take it for what it is, which is business. Don't take it personally. It's simply, 99% of the time, it's to help you do your job well. It's to help the provider do their job well and take care of the patient. So try not to take these things too personal. Leave that stuff at the door, because typically it's not. Every doctor I've ever worked for is very good about telling you something or explaining something to you, and then as long as you understood it and you say, okay, I got it, that won't happen again, they walk away and it's forgotten. They don't linger on it. They don't continue to think about it and all that. They just tell you what they have to say. Here's what I would like you to do in the future if that happens again. And you say, okay, I understand. And then we move on because we have other patients to see. So we can't dwell on those things. So try not to take some of those things too personally, please. Okay. And to kind of wrap it up, communicating with direct reports. Remember, if you're a manager, then there's a certain air of professionalism you have to display. Most of the people that work for you will typically take on your characteristics. So if you show up late to work every day, guess what the people that work for you are going to do? They're going to show up to work late every day because that becomes normal. They think that's normal. Set an example. And usually your staff will follow you with those examples, okay? Communicating with patients, remember, always in a private area when that's necessary. If you're going to share any, private protected health information, make sure that's done in a private area. Use open body language, show that you want to talk with them, that you want to have a conversation, that you're trying to build a rapport with a patient, and you're trying to display trust. The patient can trust you to tell them or to tell you what we need to know in order to take care of them. Okay. Take responsibility. Don't give excuses. Trust me, most people don't care about your excuses. Business is business. Let's get on to conducting business today. Excuses typically don't get you anywhere. So again, just take responsibility for what you do. Don't take things personally. Business is business. And we're all human, so we're going to make mistakes. So it's one thing to feel bad about a mistake. It's another thing to give excuses for the mistake. Just accept it, take responsibility for it. Ask the question, how can I do this better next time? What can I do? Or this is what I'm going to do going forward. Is that good? Is that acceptable? And usually when you approach things like that in that professional kind of, stance, then most people respond much better to you. So take responsibility, don't give excuses, and don't take things too personally, okay? Let's see, again, communicating with patients, accommodate the patients for convenience, use interpreters when necessary. Sometimes that's a professional interpreter, sometimes that's family members. Okay, so again, you got to build a rapport with the family members as well. So remain calm and focused, especially in stressful situations. Try to remain calm and allow a patient's concerns to be expressed. Let them tell you what's going on. You can guide the conversation. You can keep a patient potentially focused if they go off track. But allow them the opportunity to be open and honest with you. The more information we get from a patient, the better of a treatment plan we're going to be able to put together for them, the better we're going to be able to guide the patient through whatever they're going through right now, okay? Understand that, certain things can be viewed differently. Cultural perspectives are different. The way different cultures view healthcare in general can be different, and that can be a huge challenge for us. So it's not just, language barriers. Cultural differences actually play a big part in patient success and outcome success. So we have to always remember that, and we have to strive to kind of work through those things. Try to avoid gestures or comments or slang terms that may not be readily identifiable by somebody of another culture or somebody whose first language is not English, okay? So the next slide next two slides actually show a couple of those slang deals, right? Like take the bull by the horns. Well, in America, that means to take charge of a situation, but that may mean something different to somebody else. So be careful with some of these things. And sometimes that can be hard, especially if you have something that's already kind of built into your lexicon and you're talking, your way of talking or your speech patterns. You may have something that's very American that may not come across to somebody from Asia, or may not come across well to somebody from, a foreign speaking country. So be careful with that. All right. So hopefully I gave you a little bit of information and some of it was informative for you. And I look forward to seeing you next Monday for Monday Morning Message for Chapter 4. Baby, I can see technicolor.